I'm Claire DeWitt, and I've always been a fighter, even when life made me crawl. At 32, I thought I had it all figured out. I had worked my way up from an administrative assistant to senior project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm in Chicago. The path wasn't easy, but it was mine, and I walked it with pride. I was the kind of employee who came in early, stayed late, and remembered birthdays. My spreadsheets were immaculate, and my presentations could win over even the coldest clients. But none of that mattered when I got sick. It started with fatigue. Not the kind that coffee fixes, but the kind that seeps into your bones. I brushed it off. After all, I was always busy. But when the nosebleeds started and my vision blurred during a client meeting, I knew something was wrong. After weeks of tests, I was diagnosed with lupus. An autoimmune disease. Manageable, but life-changing. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, numb in the cold hospital gown, thinking about deadlines and deliverables. Who would take over my accounts while I sorted this out? How many sick days did I even have banked? When I finally broke the news to my boss, Thomas Langston, his reaction wasn't what I expected. He looked inconvenienced. "You'll still be able to handle client calls from home, right?" he asked, tapping away at his phone like I hadn't just told him I was chronically ill. That should have been my first red flag. But I was loyal. Too loyal. For the next 2 months, I tried to juggle doctor visits, treatments, and a full workload. The more I gave, the more they expected. Thomas piled on extra responsibilities, since you're working from home anyway. My performance began to slip, not because I wasn't trying, but because my body couldn't keep up. I was in pain constantly. Some mornings I couldn't even hold a pen. The whispers started soon after. I'd log into Zoom meetings and find them already in progress, without me. I stopped getting CC'd on important emails. And then came the real gut punch. I was removed from a major client pitch I had spent 3 months preparing. No explanation, no heads up. Just a thanks for your hard work and radio silence. One Friday afternoon, as I sat with a heating pad strapped to my back and a glass of water filled with medications beside me, I got the calendar invite. A 15-minute check-in with Thomas and HR. I didn't want to believe it, but somewhere deep down, I knew. I wore a blazer for the Zoom call, as if that might shield me from what was coming. Thomas didn't even look me in the eye. "This isn't personal, Claire," he began, like that made it better. "But we've decided to restructure the team. Your role is being eliminated." "Because I'm sick," I said flatly. It wasn't a question. He shifted uncomfortably. "We have to think about operational efficiency. It's about bandwidth and coverage, not health." HR nodded like a bobblehead next to him. My severance was 2 weeks' pay and the number for an outplacement service. That was it. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just sat there, the screen reflecting back a frozen smile that wasn't mine. But inside, I was already planning. If Thomas wanted to make this personal, I'd return the favor. I'd been loyal. He'd been a liar. And I knew things, little things. Secrets he thought no one noticed. Like how he often traveled alone to client meetings in New York but never came back with new contracts. Or how the company credit card had charges that didn't quite line up with business expenses. I had filed those reimbursements myself. I had receipts, literal ones. After the call, I opened a private folder on my laptop I hadn't touched in over a year. I'd started it the day I caught Thomas in a lie about a site visit that never happened. I'd brushed it off back then, thinking it wasn't my place to dig. But now? It was personal. And it was war. The first few days after I was fired felt like free fall. I wasn't just unemployed, I was humiliated, tossed aside like all the years I gave to that firm meant nothing. I wasn't angry yet. That would come later. Right now, I was hollow. And tired. Lupus has a way of making your body feel like a battlefield after the war's already been lost. But somehow, in the middle of all that exhaustion, I found clarity. This wasn't about the job anymore. This was about justice, about restoring my sense of control in a world that had ripped it away. I couldn't work. I couldn't climb the corporate ladder anymore. But I could burn the whole damn thing down. So, I opened the folder again. I had labeled it suspiciously out of sheer boredom over a year ago. It was a hodgepodge of screenshots, forwarded emails, flagged receipts, and digital sticky notes, nothing concrete on its own, but together, they told a story. A story of a man who had built an image of professionalism, leadership, and integrity, while hiding something slimy just beneath the surface. The first thing I dug into was the expense reports. Thomas always had a habit of traveling solo, especially on client trips. He'd stay at swanky hotels and bill them to the company under project codes that didn't match any active client accounts. I had flagged it once, gently, and he brushed it off with a condescending, "Claire, you don't understand the executive-level logistics." At the time, I let it go. But now I didn't have to be polite. I cross-referenced those expenses with my old calendar invites and project trackers. Most of the trips had no real meetings associated with them. Some were even scheduled during firm-wide blackout dates, times we never booked travel because of quarterly financial audits. That alone wouldn't prove anything. But I wasn't done. A few receipts were particularly odd. One was for a high-end floral arrangement billed to a client gift. But the delivery address? A residential apartment in Tribeca. I reverse-searched it online. It belonged to a woman named Alyssa Brandt, listed as a lifestyle blogger and consultant. No company name. No client association. And yet Thomas had sent her $300 worth of flowers during a week he was supposed to be negotiating a contract in Seattle. I dug deeper. Alyssa's social media pages were still public. She posted selfies, brunches, yoga poses, and more than a few hotel balcony shots that looked eerily familiar. I compared timestamps and realized she had stayed in the same hotels as Thomas on multiple dates. One post even featured a hotel robe with the logo from the Langford, the same spot Thomas had billed to the company twice last fall. That week, I remember, he told us he was locked in negotiations with a local property development firm. Turns out, he was locked in something else entirely. I screenshotted everything. Compiled timelines. Created a spreadsheet cross-referencing her posts with his trips, overlaying them with the corresponding expense reports. It painted a damning picture. Thomas was using company funds to fund a private relationship. And possibly worse. There was one post that really stood out. Alyssa had tagged a client dinner in Midtown Manhattan. She was dressed to the nines, posing beside a man whose face was mostly out of frame. But the watch on his wrist? I'd recognize it anywhere. It was a custom Omega Seamaster. Thomas wore it every day like it was glued to his skin. In the reflection of a glass window behind them, I caught a faint image of his profile. It was him. No doubt. So now I had motive, method, and a breadcrumb trail. But I needed something stronger, something that couldn't be brushed off as coincidence or miscommunication. That's when I remembered Ryan, one of the junior IT analysts. He was quiet, brilliant, and just a bit awkward, exactly the kind of person executives ignored, which meant he saw and heard everything. Back when I managed a systems migration project, Ryan had worked closely with me and respected me. I'd once covered for him when he accidentally deleted a shared drive. He never forgot that. I messaged him from a burner email. ClaireD1978@protonmail.com. Hey, it's Claire. I need your help. Confidential. About Thomas. The reply came 6 hours later. Ryan IT90, I was wondering when you'd reach out. I've got stuff. Let's talk. We set up a secure call through Signal. Ryan sounded nervous but determined. He told me that during a recent security audit, he discovered multiple flagged login attempts from Thomas's account, accessing files unrelated to his position, mostly financial documents and HR personnel files. I wasn't supposed to look, he said, but the red flags were too many. He even tried deleting logs afterward, but nothing ever truly gets deleted. Ryan had saved encrypted logs showing Thomas accessing Alyssa Brandt's personal information through a vendor portal the firm used. There was even authorization requests sent to legal that listed her as a branding consultant, which, of course, wasn't real. Ryan also had internal chat logs, company Slack messages, where Thomas had instructed an accountant to code all trip expenses to the Greenridge project, even though that project had been dormant for months. The more Ryan revealed, the more dangerous this all felt. This wasn't just an affair, this was corporate fraud, embezzlement, and potential identity misuse. And I had the paper trail. Told Ryan not to leak anything, yet. We needed a plan. Thomas was slick. If we moved too early, he'd spin it, bury the evidence, and frame it as a personal attack from a disgruntled former employee. I couldn't afford to be dismissed again. So, I made a list of people inside the company who hated Thomas almost as much as I did. First on the list? Simone Lee, head of business development. She had once confided in me over drinks that Thomas tried to claim her sales numbers as his during a board review. She had been furious but afraid to confront him because he was tight with the CFO. I reached out. Carefully. Simone didn't need convincing. I showed her the spreadsheet, the receipts, and Alyssa's posts. She sat silently on our Zoom call, jaw clenched, then finally whispered, "He's been skimming off budgets for 2 years." I knew it. But no one would back me up. Now she had me. Simone had access to budget forecasts and discretionary spend reports. She agreed to pull copies and send them anonymously. "If this blows back on me, Claire," she started. "It won't, I promised. We're going to do this the smart way." My next move was riskier. I reached out to Camila Rivera, a journalist I knew from college who now worked for a business ethics and corruption podcast. I gave her a teaser, just enough to prove there was a story. I didn't reveal everything yet. She was interested, but cautious. "Corporate fraud is tricky," she said. "You need more than some Instagram posts and receipts." "I have more," I said. "But I need time." The next 2 weeks were a blur. My health wasn't great, I had flares that knocked me flat some days, and others where I could barely sit up for more than a few hours. But I pushed through. Because this wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. For me. For every woman who had been discarded after giving their all. And then, like a gift from the universe, something dropped right into my lap. An anonymous envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside were copies of Thomas's company credit card statements, unredacted. They included charges for spa services, plane tickets for 2, and a reservation at a Michelin star restaurant on Valentine's Day, again billed to a client entertainment fund. There was no way to explain this away. I didn't know who sent it. Maybe Ryan. Maybe someone in accounting. But it was gold. I compiled everything, over 100 pages of documentation, and gave Camila access. She was stunned. "This is bigger than I thought," she said. "You realize this could bring your old company down, right?" "I hope it does," I replied coldly. We planned a release date. Camila's podcast would break the story first, followed by an online article with all the evidence. Simone had quietly tipped off a board member, and Ryan promised to trigger an internal audit just before the story dropped. The clock was ticking. Thomas had no idea the fuse was lit. The morning the podcast dropped, I barely slept. My body was on edge, not just from the lupus flaring again, but from anticipation. I hadn't told anyone in my personal life what I was about to do. Not my sister, not my doctor, not even my closest friends. It wasn't because I didn't trust them. I just needed this to be mine. After so much had been taken from me, my health, my job, my dignity, I wanted to own this one win. At 7:02 a.m., I got a text from Camila. "It's live. Check the homepage." I opened the podcast link and hit play. Her voice was calm and confident, the kind that pulled listeners in. Today on the Ledger Files, we bring you the story of a high-level executive who built a multi-million-dollar empire on charm, manipulation, and corporate fraud. At the center of it is one man, and the woman he thought he could silence. She never used my full name, just Claire, and referred to me as a former operations lead who was terminated under suspicious circumstances. But she didn't need to name names. The rest of the story was vivid and damning. Camila laid out the financial discrepancies, the shady consultant payments, the social media cross-references, and even included anonymized quotes from Simone and Ryan. Then came the bombshell. Camila had obtained verified credit card statements that proved Thomas had billed over $85,000 in non-business expenses over the past 2 years, including gifts, travel, and personal services. By noon, the article version of the podcast hit Twitter. It went viral within hours. Within minutes of that, everything exploded. I started getting texts from former coworkers. Some were shocked. Some weren't. One message from a fellow team leads just read, "Holy SHT. I always knew he was hiding something." By 2 p.m., someone inside the firm leaked an internal email from the CEO. Effective immediately, we are launching an independent investigation into financial misconduct allegations involving a member of our executive team. We take these claims seriously. Translation? Thomas was officially screwed. I didn't hear from him. Not directly. But I knew he was scrambling behind the scenes. My LinkedIn views spiked, and a few anonymous burner accounts tried to message me on Twitter. One even wrote, "Hope you're proud of yourself. You're ruining lives." I blocked it without replying. Because here's the thing, Thomas ruined my life first. Let me rewind a bit. The firm's legal team was in chaos. I heard through Simone that the CFO was furious. Not just because of the fraud, but because the exposure had pulled investor attention. Clients were asking questions. One of our largest accounts, a hedge fund group based in Chicago, reportedly called the board demanding answers. "We don't do business with liars," they said. The firm's stock took a hit. Not massive, but enough to shake confidence. And that was the real cost. In corporate America, perception is reality. But what really surprised me wasn't the fallout, it was the silence from Thomas. For a man who used to CC himself on emails just to make sure he got credit, he was nowhere to be found. No statement. No social media. No leaks to the press. It was as if he vanished overnight. Until the next morning. That's when his version of the story dropped. An anonymous post on a fringe business blog appeared, "Fired employee wages revenge campaign against innocent exec." It was trash. It painted me as a disgruntled, unstable ex-staffer with a vendetta against management. It hinted that I had faked documents. That I had colluded with an online journalist to smear a good man's name. He didn't use his name, but it was clearly from Thomas, or someone close to him. I should have been shaken. But I laughed. Because it was so weak. So obvious. It was the move of a man drowning and trying to grab whatever he could on the way down. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew Thomas wouldn't go down without a fight. I knew he had powerful friends, especially in finance, and I wasn't protected by any whistleblower laws since I had technically left the company. If this turned ugly, he could sue. Try to discredit me. Or worse, make me out to be mentally unstable. So, I got ahead of it. I had Camila publish a follow-up, one that included a signed statement from Simone detailing her own past run-ins with Thomas, and a new document from Ryan, an internal email where Thomas had explicitly instructed an accountant to backdate a fake invoice. That was a criminal offense. And then, the dam finally broke. A former HR executive, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, came forward. She emailed me privately first. Said her name was Janice Torres, and that she had been quietly watching everything unfold. She'd left the company 2 years prior because of ethical concerns, but never said why. Now I knew. She told me she had documented evidence that Thomas had interfered with employee medical leave approvals. That he had directly pressured HR to deny extensions or accommodations. "You weren't the first he targeted because of health issues," she said. "You were just the first to fight back." She still had access to a backup of her HR documents, screenshots, PDFs, and redacted memos. Some of those emails were about me, proof that Thomas had pushed HR to deny my medical accommodation, citing operational disruption and calling me a liability risk. I cried when I read them. Not because I was surprised, but because I finally had proof that I wasn't crazy. That everything I felt, everything I knew, was real. Camila verified the documents and published a third exposé. This time, the headline read, "Executive accused of financial fraud also linked to discrimination against chronically ill employees." That one hit differently. I started receiving messages from strangers. Women. People with lupus. Cancer survivors. Former employees who had been pushed out silently. They thanked me for speaking up. For fighting back. Some of their stories were horrifying. One woman said she had been forced out after returning from chemo. Another said she'd been denied short-term disability paperwork due to policy changes that mysteriously aligned with Thomas's promotion. It was bigger than I thought. And now, the media knew it too. Business Insider picked up the podcast. So did The Cut. Then NPR invited Camila and me for a panel on corporate discrimination. I agreed, but only if they didn't show my face. I wasn't ready for that kind of exposure. The fallout at the firm was swift. Thomas was suspended pending investigation. The board released a statement promising a comprehensive review of internal practices. The CFO, his old college buddy, resigned a week later. And 3 days after that, I got a call from the firm's general counsel. Not to threaten me, but to apologize. "We regret the way your departure was handled," the voice on the phone said, carefully avoiding any admission of guilt. "We would like to offer a settlement." I smiled. They wanted me to go away. To stop the bleeding. And while I had no interest in returning to that company, or taking hush money, I did have demands. "I want the following," I told them. A formal, public apology. A donation to the Lupus Foundation in my name. And a full review of every medical accommodation denial in the last 5 years. Silence. Then, "We'll review your request and respond in writing." They did. 2 weeks later, the apology was issued on the firm's website. The donation was made. And an internal audit of HR practices was quietly launched. They wouldn't confirm it publicly, but I had eyes inside. They were cleaning house. And Thomas? Gone. Resigned for personal reasons, with no severance. No golden parachute. Last I heard, he was trying to start a boutique consulting firm. But clients weren't biting. Too much bad press. Too many burned bridges. And me? I finally exhaled. The weeks following the firm's public apology felt like a strange kind of peace. Not the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket, but the kind that settles after a storm, muddy, raw, and eerily quiet. I wasn't celebrating, not exactly. But I slept through the night for the first time in months. I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed. I even found myself smiling, real smiles, not the brittle ones I'd been forcing for so long. Camila and I stayed in close touch. She was already being approached by other whistleblowers, but she kept saying my story had changed her career. "You made people believe," she told me during a late-night call. "You cracked something open." Especially for sick and disabled professionals who've been silenced for years. I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't feel heroic. I felt tired. But as the media buzz slowed and life began to normalize, something strange happened. I got a job offer. It came from a small but rapidly growing consultancy that had been following the story closely. The founder, a woman named Valerie, reached out personally. "I've had lupus since I was 23, she told me in our first Zoom call. When I saw what you did, I knew I had to talk to you." She offered me a role as director of operations, fully remote, with built-in flexibility and unlimited sick leave. It wasn't a pity hire. She'd read my old project portfolios and even contacted a few former colleagues. "You're exactly what we need," she said. I accepted. It felt poetic somehow, to be hired not in spite of my illness, but because someone understood it didn't define my ability. And yet, even as things began to heal, I kept thinking about something Janice had told me during our first phone call. "There's more you don't know," she'd said. About Thomas. About how far this went. At the time, I didn't push her. I thought exposing the fraud and getting justice was enough. But as I settled into my new role, curiosity clawed its way back in. What else had been hidden? So, I reached out. "Do you still have access to the internal server backups?" I asked her one afternoon. Janice was cautious. "What are you looking for?" I didn't know, exactly. Just that the pattern with Thomas, the manipulation, the cruelty, felt too consistent. Like it was bigger than one man being a jerk. I wanted to know how deep the rot went. Janice sent me a secured link a few days later. It was a cache of internal HR correspondence from the years Thomas had been VP and then executive director. She'd stripped names where necessary, but the context was clear. There were dozens of emails referencing terminations, liability flags, and reputation risk candidates. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. A memo dated March 15, 2 years ago, marked confidential, for executive review only. Subject: Special Employee Vetting Initiative. It outlined a so-called internal health risk tracker, a spreadsheet tracking employees who had disclosed chronic health conditions, mental health diagnoses, or had taken more than 2 extended sick leaves in one calendar year. The document included coded notes on each employee's reliability, performance consistency, and a column labeled, "Retention Recommendation." I felt sick reading it. This wasn't just corporate belt-tightening. This was targeted discrimination. And it had been institutionalized. The spreadsheet even had entries for employees I remembered, people who had quietly vanished after HR restructuring. One name jumped out at me, Marcus Lane, a senior analyst who had spoken openly about living with MS. He'd been fired without warning 6 months after that. The worst part? My name was on that list too. Claire M., Operational Lead Medical, Autoimmune, Unspecified, Absences, 11 days, Q2, 7 days, Q4, Risk Level, Moderate Note, Observe for signs of burnout. If unable to maintain pace, initiate transition by Q1. It was a blueprint for elimination. Thomas hadn't acted alone. This tracker had multiple contributors, HR reps, legal advisors, and at least one board member. And it was more than just cruel. It was likely illegal. I stared at the screen for a long time. My stomach twisted. How many lives had been affected by this quiet, calculated culling? How many people had been made to feel less than for something they couldn't control? I forwarded the memo to Camila. Her reply came 2 minutes later. Jesus Christ. This changes everything. We met in person for the first time 2 days later. She flew out and insisted we talk over coffee at a quiet little place near my apartment. She was smaller than I expected, wiry and intense, like someone who's always 10 steps ahead of the world. "We have to go public with this," she said, tapping the printed memo on the table. "This isn't just one bad boss. This is a systemic policy. If we can connect this to actual terminations, we might be looking at a class action." The idea terrified me. Not because I didn't want justice, but because this would go far beyond what I'd prepared for. It wouldn't just be my story anymore. It would be everyone's. I asked for a few days to think. In the meantime, I tried to find Marcus Lane. I remembered he'd been active on LinkedIn, but his profile was gone. I eventually found a blog he'd started, quiet, raw, and filled with reflections about being pushed out of corporate life due to invisible discrimination. I messaged him. He replied the next day. Yes, I was let go suddenly. They said it was performance-based, but there were no warnings. Just one bad review out of nowhere. I always felt it was about my illness. But I couldn't prove it. I sent him the memo. He didn't reply for 2 days. Then, Claire. Thank you. I'm in. We weren't alone. Camila found 4 other former employees who were also on the tracker. Some had taken legal action in the past but were paid off in settlements with NDAs. A few were ready to talk again, especially if they weren't the only ones. And then Camila got the final piece. An internal audio recording from a whistleblower, someone who'd secretly recorded a leadership retreat. On it, you could clearly hear Thomas's voice. Look, I'm not saying we fire everyone with a prescription bottle, but we have to think strategically. Sick employees are expensive. They drag down performance. You want loyalty? You need strength. I listened to that clip 6 times. Each time, my hand shook. He hadn't just wanted me out. He believed people like me didn't deserve to be in the room. That was the moment I decided. No more hesitation. No more fear. We were going public. Camila began prepping a full investigative series, complete with interviews, documents, and the audio. We hired a media attorney to make sure everything was protected and legally solid. I contacted a civil rights organization that agreed to explore potential litigation on behalf of affected employees. When the story finally broke, it wasn't just news. It was national. Top executive linked to discriminatory employee purge at major finance firm read the headline. It ran everywhere: The New York Times, Forbes, CNN. The firm released a panicked statement within hours, promising zero tolerance for unethical behavior and immediate termination of anyone involved. But it was too late. The SEC launched a formal inquiry. The Department of Labor opened a case. And within days, a class action lawsuit was filed by a dozen former employees, including me. As for Thomas? He didn't just lose his company. He lost his legacy. The man who once prided himself on his image, who curated every LinkedIn post, every keynote speech, was now the face of workplace discrimination. His consulting business never launched. His speaking engagements were cancelled. I even heard his alma mater removed him from the alumni spotlight page. Karma, it turned out, was very real. But even more real was the community that rose up in the aftermath. People across the country, chronically ill workers, disability advocates, allies, began sharing their own stories. For the first time, companies were being asked not just about diversity and inclusion, but about how they treated employees who couldn't perform at 110% every single day. My inbox filled with messages of solidarity, of gratitude, and finally, of opportunity. Publishers reached out. So did advocacy groups. Some asked if I'd be willing to speak, to write, to lead. I didn't say yes right away. I was still healing, still building. But in the quiet moments, when I looked at what we'd accomplished, not just justice, but change, I realized something. Thomas had fired me to make me disappear. But instead, he made me visible. 6 months after the lawsuit was filed, I sat on stage in front of a crowd of nearly 200 professionals, all eyes fixed on me. The banner behind me read, "Redefining Strength, Chronic Illness in the Modern Workplace." If you had told me a year ago, I'd be here, as the keynote speaker at a national HR and leadership conference, I would have laughed, and then probably cried. But there I was. Alive. Employed. Empowered. And finally, heard. I told my story in full, no filters, no polite softening of the truth. I spoke about the burnout, the dismissal, the calculated betrayal, and the corporate machine that tried to chew me up and spit me out. I described the spreadsheet, the audio, the people behind the curtain who decided I was a liability instead of a human being. The silence in the room was thick. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others wiped their eyes. And when I was done, they stood and clapped. Not out of pity. But because I had said what too many were afraid to say, that sickness doesn't make you less valuable. That needing support is not the same as being weak. That disability is not a threat to productivity, it's a measure of how deeply a workplace can commit to humanity. When I walked off stage, a woman followed me into the hall. She looked maybe 40, stylish but tired, with a lanyard that said VP of Compliance. "Claire," she said, extending her hand. "I just wanted to say, thank you. I've had rheumatoid arthritis for 9 years. Never told anyone. I've been afraid it would kill my career." I squeezed her hand. "You're not alone anymore." And she started to cry. Back home, the lawsuit continued to unfold. Discovery unearthed even more damning documents, emails between Thomas and board members joking about cutting the herd, performance reviews altered post-signature to justify sudden terminations, even a paid consulting firm that helped develop the Employee Health Risk Index. The firm's legal team tried to claim rogue behavior. They blamed Thomas, then HR, then the data analytics team. But none of it stuck. The culture had been systemic. The rot had gone deep. Eventually, a settlement offer came through. It wasn't hushing money. Not this time. It included financial compensation for everyone named in the complaint, reinstatement offers for those who still wanted to return, no one did, and, most importantly, an independent oversight committee to rebuild the firm's HR and wellness policies from the ground up. They also agreed to fund a national initiative supporting chronically ill professionals in the workplace. We didn't get everything we wanted. But we got enough. Thomas never publicly apologized. He went dark after the SEC opened their investigation. The last I heard, he was living abroad, trying to rebrand himself as a remote culture advisor. The internet wasn't kind to him. His reputation was trashed. His name was now permanently linked to one of the worst discrimination scandals in recent corporate history. It wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense. No handcuffs. No courtroom meltdown. Just exposure. Just truth. And that was enough for me. My new job with Valerie's consultancy took off in ways I never expected. We expanded. Doubled our clients. Built a remote-first model with a focus on inclusion that other firms started copying. I developed internal policies for chronic condition management that were published in several business journals. I even helped draft proposed federal legislation for better workplace protections for chronically ill employees. I was doing more than recovering. I was thriving. But one day, out of nowhere, I received an email that stopped me cold. Subject: just wanted to say something. It was from Lena, my former coworker. The one who had always smiled at me like nothing was wrong. Who sat silently through my performance review while they gutted my career in front of her. She'd vanished after the scandal went public. I assumed she had distanced herself from it all. Her email was short. "Claire, I should have said something sooner. I knew what they were doing. I didn't have proof, but I saw it happening. I saw it happening to you. I was scared. I wanted to protect my own job. And I was weak. But you weren't. I watched everything unfold, and I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. You were right to fight. You helped people like me more than you know. I'm not expecting forgiveness. Just wanted you to know." Lena. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the message, reread it 3 times, then closed my laptop and went for a walk. It was a warm afternoon. Birds chirped above the quiet street. I'd passed a playground, some kids laughing and falling over each other like it was the easiest thing in the world to just be. Lena had betrayed me, yes. But she was also a product of the same toxic fear that kept so many silent. I couldn't absolve her. But I understood her. That night, I replied, "Lena, thank you for reaching out. I won't pretend it didn't hurt when you stayed quiet. But I also know what fear does to people in environments like that. I don't need an apology. Just hope that when you see this kind of thing again, you'll speak. Not for me. But for the next person. We all deserve better." Claire, months passed. The headlines faded. The scandal became a case study in HR conferences. And my life settled into a new normal, one built on honesty, flexibility, and purpose. Then, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, I received an invitation. Harvard Business Review wanted me to contribute a personal essay to a special edition on ethical leadership. They titled the piece, "The Strength They Didn't See." It was the final twist in a story I never asked to write, but one I now owned fully. Because here's the truth, I didn't get revenge by ruining someone else's life, I got revenge by reclaiming mine. By refusing to disappear. By turning pain into power. By taking the silence they forced on me, and replacing it with a voice that could no longer be ignored. They tried to erase me because I got sick. Instead, I became the story they never wanted told. And now, I'm just getting started.